Hello everyone, I am Mr. Disturbing, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Watchers at Laurel Gap. There exists an unspoken bond among those who walk the long trails, a sacred trust that binds strangers together in the wilderness. We pass each other with knowing nods, share water sources without question, and offer shelter from storms without hesitation. For years I believed in this code absolutely, trusted in the inherent goodness of those who seek solitude in the mountains. That faith died on a cold October night in Southwest Virginia, where I learned that some who walk among us carry darkness in their hearts, and the wilderness can become a hunting ground for predators who wear familiar faces. The three of us had been hiking together for nearly 5 years, working our way through different sections of the Appalachian Trail whenever our schedules aligned. Sarah, a nurse from Richmond, had introduced me to serious backpacking after we met in college. Maya joined us later, a quiet engineer from DC who could read topographic maps like poetry and had an uncanny ability to find the most secluded campsites. We weren't weekend warriors or Instagram hikers seeking perfect sunrise photos. We were methodical, experienced, and deeply respectful of the wilderness that had become our sanctuary. October in Southwest Virginia offered everything we craved. Crisp air that bit at exposed skin, forests painted in impossible shades of amber and scarlet, and trails largely abandoned by summer crowds. We had chosen a remote stretch near Mount Rogers, planning to spend 3 days exploring unmarked paths and forgotten logging roads that promised true isolation. The forecast called for clear skies and temperatures dropping into the 30s at night, perfect conditions for the kind of hiking that stripped away all pretense and left you feeling genuinely alive. The first day unfolded exactly as we had hoped. We passed only one other hiker, an elderly man with kind eyes who offered us homemade trail mix and warned about a family of bears he had spotted near Grayson Highlands. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, filled with the easy camaraderie that exists between people who understand why someone would choose to carry everything they need on their back into places where cell phones become useless weight. By late afternoon, we had reached the shelter we had marked on our maps, a 3-sided wooden structure that offered protection from wind and a designated space for overnight camping. From a distance, it looked perfect, exactly what we needed after 12 miles of steady climbing. But as we approached, something shifted in the atmosphere around us, a subtle wrongness that made my skin prickle with unease. 3 men occupied the shelter, their gear spread across the sleeping platform in a way that seemed deliberately territorial. They looked up as we approached, but their acknowledgement felt different from the usual friendly greeting exchanged between hikers. Their stares lingered too long, moving over us with an intensity that made me instinctively step closer to Sarah and Maya. One of them, a heavy-set man with greasy hair pulled back in a ponytail, smiled in a way that never reached his eyes. Maya, who had developed almost supernatural instincts about people during her years of solo hiking, caught my arm and spoke quietly about pressing on to find another campsite. Sarah, ever diplomatic, suggested we at least rest and refill our water bottles before deciding, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing back at the men who continued watching us with that unsettling focus. We stayed maybe 10 minutes, long enough to filter water from the nearby spring and study our maps. The men asked questions that seemed innocuous on the surface but felt probing, invasive. How long had we been on the trail? Were we hiking alone? Did anyone know exactly where we planned to camp? Their interest felt predatory rather than conversational, each question designed to gather information rather than make connection. When we finally shouldered our packs and announced our intention to hike further before dark, I caught the look that passed between 2 of the men. It lasted perhaps a second, but in that moment I saw something that chilled me to the bone. Recognition. Planning. The kind of silent communication that exists between people who have worked together before, who understand each other's intentions without words. We left the shelter and continued up the trail, but none of us spoke for nearly a mile. The forest around us felt different now, less like sanctuary and more like a place where we were being observed. Every snapping branch, every rustle in the undergrowth made us pause and listen. Maya finally broke the silence, voicing what we were all thinking. Those men had not been ordinary hikers, and we needed to get as far away from them as possible. 2 miles from the shelter, we found what appeared to be an old logging road that branched off from the main trail and disappeared into dense forest. Without discussing it, we turned onto this forgotten path, pushing through overgrown brush and fallen trees until we reached a small clearing beside a creek. It felt hidden, protected, far enough from any marked trail that no casual hiker would stumble across our camp. We set up our tent quickly and efficiently, the familiar routine offering some comfort in the growing darkness. But as we prepared our dinner, that sense of being watched intensified. The forest around us had fallen into an unnatural silence. No night sounds from the creatures that should have been active in the cooling air. Even the creek seemed muted, its gentle babbling barely audible above the sound of our own breathing. Sarah suggested we skip the campfire, and neither Maya nor I argued. We ate cold food in gathering darkness, speaking in whispers about our unease and making plans for an early departure the next morning. But as the temperature dropped and full darkness settled over our hidden campsite, we began to hear sounds that made our blood run cold. Footsteps, not the random movement of wildlife, but deliberate human footsteps moving through the forest around us. They would approach our campsite, circle at a distance we could never quite pinpoint, then fade away only to return from a different direction. Sometimes we heard voices, low murmurs just at the edge of perception, never clear enough to understand but unmistakably human. Around midnight, Maya grabbed my arm and pointed toward the tree line. 4 distinct lights moved between the trees, flashlight beams that would appear for a few seconds before being extinguished, only to reappear somewhere else entirely. We watched in growing horror as these lights formed a rough perimeter around our camp, proof that we were surrounded by people who had followed us into the wilderness with clear intent. The most terrifying moment came when one of the lights approached close enough that we could make out the silhouette holding it. A man stood at the edge of our clearing, maybe 30 yards away, completely motionless except for the steady sweep of his flashlight beam across our tent. In his other hand, something metallic caught the light, long and blade-like, held with the casual confidence of someone who had used such tools before. Sarah reached into her pack and withdrew the pistol she always carried on remote hikes, a precaution we had often joked about but never expected to need. The metallic click as she chambered a round seemed impossibly loud in the silent forest. The man with the blade must have heard it because his light immediately went dark, and we heard rapid movement through the brush as he retreated. But we all understood that this was not a retreat born of fear. It was tactical repositioning, the movement of someone who was part of a larger group and needed to coordinate their next approach. We were not dealing with opportunistic criminals or desperate addicts seeking easy targets. These were organized predators who had turned the wilderness into their hunting ground, and we had walked directly into their territory. Without speaking, we began breaking down our camp in complete darkness, stuffing gear into packs with the desperate efficiency of people who knew their lives depended on speed. The sounds around us intensified as our pursuers realized we were preparing to flee. Footsteps approaching from multiple directions, the snap of branches as bodies moved through dense undergrowth. We abandoned the trail entirely, using Maya's compass and our combined knowledge of these mountains to navigate through pathless forest toward what we hoped was the main road. Behind us, the lights continued their deadly dance, sometimes appearing close enough that we could hear heavy breathing, sometimes fading to nothing before reappearing ahead of us, proof that our hunters knew these woods far better than we did. The next 6 hours became a blur of desperate movement through thorns and deadfall, of whispered arguments about direction, of pure animal terror driving us forward when exhaustion threatened to stop us entirely. We crossed streams, climbed ridges, and pushed through vegetation so dense it tore at our clothes and skin. Several times we had to drop to the ground and lie motionless as lights swept the area around us, our hearts hammering so loudly we were certain they would give away our position. Dawn found us scratched, bleeding, and utterly exhausted at the edge of a small town, flagging down a pickup truck driven by a local farmer who took one look at our condition and immediately drove us to the sheriff's office. We told our story to a deputy who listened with professional courtesy but obvious skepticism, making notes but asking few questions. When we mentioned the men at the shelter and our belief that we had been deliberately hunted, his demeanor shifted to something approaching dismissal. The investigation, such as it was, lasted less than a week. Officials claimed they found no evidence of criminal activity at the shelter or in the area where we had been pursued. The men we described could not be located or identified. Our experience was written off as a case of nervous hikers misinterpreting natural sounds and becoming lost in unfamiliar terrain. The official report suggested we had panicked and imagined much of what we believed we had experienced. But 2 weeks after our return home, Maya discovered something that validated our terror and explained the authorities' reluctance to investigate. Online hiking forums contained scattered reports of disappearances in that exact area over the past 3 years. 2 solo hikers had simply vanished, their cars found at trailheads, but no trace of them ever discovered despite extensive searches. Another pair of hikers had been found dead under circumstances that were never fully explained, their deaths attributed to exposure despite evidence that suggested otherwise. The most chilling detail emerged from a post by someone who claimed to be a local law enforcement officer, writing anonymously about pressure from higher authorities to avoid investigating certain incidents in the national forest. According to this source, there were people living deep in these mountains who operated outside normal society, and confronting them would create problems that nobody wanted to deal with. It was easier to write off disappearances as hiking accidents and discourage further investigation. Sarah, Maya, and I never hiked together again after that night. The bond that had connected us through years of shared adventure had been severed by our encounter with something that violated every assumption we had made about the wilderness and the people who inhabited it. We had learned that evil does not always announce itself with obvious signs, that predators can wear the familiar uniforms of fellow hikers, and that the institutions we trusted to protect us were sometimes complicit in our abandonment. The Appalachian Trail continues to draw thousands of hikers every year, people seeking peace and connection with nature in one of America's last wild places. Most will find exactly what they are looking for, returning home with memories of stunning vistas and profound solitude. But some will encounter the watchers who move through these mountains with patience and purpose, who understand that isolation can become vulnerability, and who have learned to use our trust against us. In the deep woods where cell phones cannot reach and help is days away, we are never as alone as we believe, and those who watch from the shadows do not always have our best interests at heart. I pulled over and shut off the engine, immediately struck by the absolute silence that settled around me. No distant highway noise, no hum of civilization, just the kind of quiet that makes you aware of your own heartbeat. The darkness beyond my headlights was impenetrable, a wall of black that seemed to absorb light rather than simply exist without it. I grabbed my small flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out of the car. The forest sounds were different here. Not the pleasant symphony of crickets and nightbirds I was used to, but something more subdued, almost nervous. Even the insects seemed to be holding their breath. I walked around to the passenger side of the car, planning to step just far enough into the trees to handle my business quickly and get back on the road. I'd barely taken 3 steps away from the vehicle when he appeared. The man seemed to materialize from the darkness itself, stepping out from behind a massive oak tree with the kind of fluid silence that only comes from someone who knows how to move through the forest unseen. He was maybe 40 feet away when I first spotted him, close enough that I could make out the long barrel of the rifle pointed directly at my chest, close enough to see that his eyes reflected my flashlight beam like an animal's. Everything in my body went cold. Not the gradual chill of fear, but the instant, bone-deep cold that comes when your brain recognizes a threat to your survival. My flashlight beam trembled as I tried to process what was happening. The man was tall and lean, wearing dark clothing that blended perfectly with the forest around him. His face was partially obscured by shadow, but I could see enough to know that this wasn't some confused hunter or lost hiker. This was someone who had been waiting. He gestured with the rifle toward my car, a simple motion that needed no words. The message was clear. Get in the driver's seat and don't make any sudden movements. My legs felt like water as I stumbled back toward the vehicle, my mind racing through options that all seemed to end badly. Running would get me shot. Fighting would get me shot. Refusing would definitely get me shot. So I opened the driver's door with hands that shook so badly I could barely grip the handle. He moved with practiced efficiency, sliding into the passenger seat while keeping the rifle trained on me the entire time. Up close, I could see that his clothes were dirty and worn, as if he'd been living rough for weeks or months. His hair was long and unkempt, his beard patchy and wild. But it was his eyes that truly terrified me. They held the kind of desperate intensity I'd only seen in cornered animals. The rifle never wavered as he settled into the seat beside me. It was a hunting rifle, the kind used for big game, and at this distance it would do far more damage than necessary to put me down permanently. He kept glancing at the mirrors, his body coiled with tension, as if he expected something to come charging out of the forest at any moment. Whatever he was running from, it had him more terrified than I was. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. He would occasionally point left or right with his free hand, directing me deeper into the mountain wilderness along increasingly narrow and poorly maintained roads. My hands were slick with sweat on the steering wheel, and I found myself taking shallow, careful breaths, afraid that even normal breathing might somehow provoke him. The road we were following was barely more than a dirt track, winding through dense forest with no sign of human habitation. Tree branches scraped against the windows, and more than once I had to slow to navigate around fallen logs or washouts from recent storms. This wasn't a route that appeared on any map. It was the kind of path that locals use to access hunting camps or illegal stills, invisible to outsiders and forgotten by time. That's when we saw the trap. Our headlights illuminated the scene maybe 50 yards ahead. A man lying motionless in the middle of the road, his body positioned in a way that would force any approaching vehicle to stop. To the right, partially hidden among the trees, I caught a glimpse of a dark-colored sedan with its lights off. The setup was obvious and crude, but it would have been effective against anyone not already on high alert. The man beside me made a sound that was part curse, part animal growl. He knew exactly what we were looking at, and his reaction told me everything I needed to know about what would happen if we stopped to help the apparently injured man in the road. I started to slow down, instinctively responding to what appeared to be someone in need of assistance. The rifle barrel pressed against my ribs with enough force to leave a bruise. I understood immediately and pressed the accelerator, steering toward the left shoulder to go around the prone figure. As we passed, I caught a glimpse of the man's face in my headlights. His eyes were open and alert, tracking our movement with the calculating gaze of a predator whose trap had just been avoided. The attack came as we cleared the fake accident scene. Two men burst from the tree line on our left, moving with military precision. One carried what looked like a shotgun, the other had some kind of automatic weapon. They opened fire before I even had time to fully process what was happening. The rear window exploded inward, showering us with safety glass. Bullets punched through the trunk and back seat, filling the car with the deafening sound of metal tearing metal. I yanked the steering wheel hard right, leaving the dirt road entirely and plunging into the forest along what might have been an old logging trail. Branches whipped against the windshield as we bounced and lurched through the undergrowth. The car's suspension was never designed for this kind of abuse, and I could hear something important break somewhere underneath us with each jarring impact. Behind us, muzzle flashes lit up the forest like deadly lightning, and I could hear the attackers shouting to each other over the sound of our engine. I killed the headlights and kept driving by instinct and prayer alone, following the faint path through pure feel. We crashed through a small stream, the car's undercarriage scraping against rocks, then up a steep embankment that had the engine screaming in protest. Finally, I found a depression between two large boulders and brought the car to a stop, the engine ticking as it cooled in the sudden silence. We sat there in absolute darkness, both of us breathing hard. I could hear my passenger's rifle creaking as his grip shifted on the stock, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a powerful truck engine growing louder. Our pursuers were still hunting, driving the main road slowly, probably listening for any sound that might give away our location. The truck passed within maybe 100 yards of where we sat hidden. Through the trees, I could see the sweep of their spotlight as they searched the forest, and I found myself holding my breath as if they might somehow hear me from that distance. The light passed over our hiding spot twice, but the combination of darkness and natural cover kept us invisible. After what felt like an eternity, the sound of the truck faded away down the mountain. We waited another 20 minutes before my passenger finally lowered his rifle and spoke the first words he'd said since getting into my car. He asked me to take him to the nearest town, his voice hoarse and exhausted. I drove him to a small settlement about 15 miles away, a place so insignificant it didn't even have a name on most maps. Just a few dozen houses clustered around a single gas station and a church that looked like it had been built sometime during the Eisenhower administration. He got out without a word of explanation or thanks, shouldering his rifle and walking away into the darkness between the houses. I never saw him again. The police were polite but skeptical when I finally worked up the courage to report what had happened. They took down my statement, examined the bullet holes in my car, and promised to investigate. But when I called back a few weeks later, I was told that no bodies had been found at the location I described, no evidence of any kind of criminal activity. The case was closed due to lack of evidence. I've thought about that night countless times over the years since, trying to piece together what really happened on that dark mountain road. Who was the man with the rifle? What was he running from that had him so terrified? What did the men who attacked us want badly enough to kill for it? The truth is, I'll probably never know. The Appalachian Mountains are full of secrets, and some of them are guarded by people who will do anything to keep them buried. Whatever business was being conducted in those dark hollows, whatever was worth killing to protect, it exists in a world that operates by rules I don't understand and don't want to learn. But I know this much. The mountains aren't just home to wildlife and natural beauty. They're also home to people who live outside the law, outside civilization, outside any moral framework that most of us would recognize. People for whom violence is just another tool, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. I still drive those mountain roads sometimes, though not as often as I used to. And when I do, I keep my doors locked, my tank full, and my eyes on the road ahead. Because somewhere out there in the darkness between the trees, there are watchers who have been waiting far longer than any of us can imagine. And some of them are still hunting. In the heart of eastern Kentucky, nestled in a valley so deep that sunlight only touches the ground for a few precious hours each day, there exists an unspoken understanding passed down through generations. The mountains have their own language, their own justice, and most importantly, their own rules. I learned this the hard way. My family has lived in these hollers for over a century. My great-grandmother used to tell me that the mountains remember everything. Every footstep, every whisper, every transgression. The old ways keep us safe, she would say, her weathered hands gesturing toward the tree line that seemed to press closer to our cabin with each passing year. You don't question the mountains, you don't challenge them, and you never ever follow voices that call from the darkness. I thought I understood what she meant. Growing up here, you learn to respect the silences, to notice when the forest goes too quiet, to trust the feeling in your gut when something feels wrong. But understanding and truly believing are two different things entirely. The story I'm about to tell you happened 3 years ago, in the weeks following my younger sister Emma's funeral. She had been 23, bright and full of plans that would never come to pass. A drunk driver on a rainy October night had stolen her from us in an instant, leaving a hole in our family that felt like it would never heal. I had always been the one Emma came to when she needed to talk. Late-night phone calls about boys, about college stress, about her dreams of leaving Kentucky and seeing the world. In the days after her death, I found myself walking the same mountain paths we had explored as children, desperate to feel close to her again. Our family's property stretches back into the mountains for nearly 2 miles, following an old creek bed that winds through stands of ancient oak and poplar. Emma and I had spent countless afternoons following that creek, building dams with river rocks, catching crawdads in mason jars, sharing secrets under the canopy of leaves that filtered the sunlight into dancing patterns. It was on one of these walks, about 2 weeks after the funeral, that I first noticed something had changed. The silence was wrong. I had walked this path hundreds of times and I knew its rhythms. The soft rustle of leaves in the evening breeze, the distant call of whippoorwills as dusk approached, the gentle babble of water over stones. But that evening, everything had gone unnaturally quiet. Even the creek seemed muted, as if the very mountains were holding their breath. I should have turned back then. Every instinct my great-grandmother had instilled in me was screaming that something was off. But grief makes you do foolish things. It makes you desperate for any connection to what you've lost. As I rounded a familiar bend in the path, I heard it for the first time. A whisper of my name carried on a breeze that shouldn't have existed in that suffocating stillness. The voice sounded exactly like Emma's. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart hammering against my ribs. The logical part of my mind knew it was impossible. I had been at the viewing. I had seen her lying in that casket, pale and still, wearing the blue dress she had bought for her college graduation. I had watched them lower her into the ground, but the voice came again, softer this time, like a secret shared between sisters. It seemed to emanate from a narrow game trail that branched off from the main path, leading deeper into the mountains where the trees grew so thick that daylight barely penetrated even at noon. This was a part of the forest my great-grandmother had always warned us to avoid, a place where she claimed the old spirits still walked. Every rational thought in my head told me to turn around and go home. But grief isn't rational. And the voice sounded so much like Emma, so full of the warmth and love I had lost forever. I took a step toward the trail. The moment my foot crossed that invisible boundary between the familiar path and the forbidden woods, everything changed. The temperature dropped at least 10 degrees, and a smell hit me that I will never forget. The scent of earth and decay, but underneath it something sweeter, like flowers left too long in a vase. The voice came again, closer now, calling my name with an urgency that made my chest tight with longing. I pushed deeper into the woods, branches catching at my clothes, thorns drawing thin lines of blood across my arms. The trail seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied the geography I thought I knew. Trees that should have been landmarks disappeared behind me, as if the forest itself was rearranging to keep me lost. But I kept following that voice, that impossible echo of my sister's laugh drifting through the darkness between the trees. It wasn't until I reached a small clearing I had never seen before that I began to understand the true nature of my mistake. In the center of the clearing stood a single massive oak tree, its trunk so wide that it would have taken 6 people holding hands to encircle it. The bark was scarred with marks that looked almost like writing, symbols that seemed to shift and change when I wasn't looking directly at them. And hanging from the lowest branch was something that made my blood freeze in my veins: Emma's locket. The silver heart pendant our grandmother had given her on her 16th birthday. The one that had been buried with her. As I stared at that impossible sight, the whispers started again. But this time, they weren't just Emma's voice. There were others, men, women, children, all calling names, all pleading and desperate. The sound seemed to come from the tree itself, as if the ancient oak was a repository for every soul the mountains had claimed. I reached up toward the locket with trembling fingers, and that's when I saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, watching me from the shadows between the trees. They reflected what little light filtered through the canopy like the eyes of nocturnal animals, but there was an intelligence behind them that was utterly, terrifyingly human. I ran. I crashed through the underbrush, tearing through briars and low-hanging branches, following no path except the one that led away from that clearing and whatever dwelled there. Behind me, the whispers rose to a chorus, voices calling names that might have belonged to the missing, the lost, the ones who had answered similar calls in the darkness. When I finally burst out of the tree line and saw our cabin in the distance, the sun was setting, though I could have sworn I had only been in the woods for minutes. My clothes were shredded, my arms and face covered in scratches that burned like fire. But the worst part was the silence that followed me home. For 3 days afterward, nothing felt right. The forest that had been my sanctuary for my entire life now felt hostile, watchful. I would catch movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't exist in broad daylight. At night, I would wake to the sound of footsteps on our front porch, but when I looked, nothing was there. The dogs in our hollow, usually vocal and territorial, went silent. Not just quiet, silent in a way that made their absence of sound more noticeable than any barking could have been. On the 4th night, I woke to find every door in our house standing wide open. I had locked them before going to bed, the same ritual I had followed every night since childhood. But there they were. Front door, back door, even the door to the root cellar, all gaping open to the mountain darkness beyond. and standing in the doorway to my bedroom was a figure I recognized but couldn't accept. Emma, or something wearing her face. She looked exactly as she had in life, down to the small scar on her chin from a childhood fall, the way she always stood with her weight shifted to her left hip. But her eyes were wrong. They held a depth of knowledge that belonged to something far older and more patient than my 23-year-old sister. She didn't speak. She just smiled and gestured for me to follow her outside. Every muscle in my body was screaming at me to stay put, to slam the door and never look back. But the pull was so strong, the longing to have her back so overwhelming, that I found myself taking a step forward. It was only the memory of my great-grandmother's words that stopped me at the threshold. "The mountains take what they're owed," she had always said, "and they never forget a debt." I slammed the door and turned the lock with shaking hands. When I looked out the window, an hour later, the figure was gone. But pressed into the soft earth of our front yard were footprints that led from the porch to the edge of the woods and then simply vanished, as if whoever had made them had been lifted into the air. I left Kentucky the next morning and haven't been back since, but every night, no matter where I am, I still hear the whispers. Sometimes it's Emma's voice, sweet and familiar, calling me to come home. Sometimes it's the chorus of all those other voices, the ones that answered the call before I was smart enough to resist. The mountains remember everything, and they never forget a debt. I broke their rules. I followed a voice that called from the darkness. I crossed a boundary that was never meant to be crossed. And even though I escaped that night, I know the debt hasn't been paid. In the Appalachian Mountains, some prices are collected immediately. Others are payment plans that stretch across years, across decades, across generations. The mountains are patient. They have all the time in the world. And someday, when my guard is down, when the longing becomes too strong to resist, I know I'll hear that voice again. Emma's voice, calling me home to a place where the dead don't rest and the trees remember every soul they've claimed. The mountains never forget, and they never forgive.